"It's time you did something useful, Dad." That was the first thing my daughter said after I blew out my birthday candles. Not happy birthday, Dad. Not a hug. The smoke from the candles hadn't even cleared, and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, the one I loved with everything I had, looked at me with these tired eyes. The kind of look you give an old piece of furniture you've decided to get rid of. And she told me it was time I did something useful. I'm 68 years old, and I've spent my whole life being useful to her at least. But here's the funny part. She had no idea. Then she slid a piece of paper across the table. She told me to sign it, to sell the house I'd lived in for 40 years. The house where my wife took her last breath. The house where that very girl spent her entire childhood. I looked at the paper. I didn't touch it. I didn't slam the table, though God knows I wanted to. I just reached for my glass of water, took one slow sip, and set it back down. Because there was something she didn't know. 5 days earlier, I'd watched $21,000 vanish from my credit card. Plane tickets to Italy, business class, 12 nights on the Amalfi Coast. 3 passengers. I read those 3 names on the screen over and over. My daughter, my son-in-law, and a third name. Not mine, of course. The man who paid for the trip wasn't allowed to set foot on it. That's how they spend the money of a man they consider useless. And right now, you're trying to guess what I did with that piece of paper, aren't you? Don't get ahead of me. Trust me, the best part isn't what I did. It's why I let it get this far in the first place. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Marcus. I'm 68 years old. I worked 33 years as a civil inspector for the county here in Sacramento, signing off on bridges and overpasses and parking structures, the boring stuff that holds a city up while nobody thinks about it. I'm not wealthy. I drive a 2018 Tacoma with a dent in the tailgate I never bothered to fix. I make drip coffee every morning at 5:45 because my body forgot how to sleep past that the year my wife died. Her name was Eleanor. Ovarian cancer took her 11 years ago, slow and cruel. And after that it was just me and an old basset hound named Walter, who followed her out of this world about 3 years later. After Walter, the house got very quiet. You learn to live inside that quiet. You don't ever really get used to it. I have one child, a daughter. I'm going to keep her real name out of this, so I'll call her June, because that was Eleanor's middle name and my girl has her mother's stubbornness. She's 36 now. Married a man I'll just call my son-in-law, because legally that's the title, even though the word son sat wrong in my mouth from the first handshake. He sold commercial property leases, made a comfortable living, comfortable enough to drive a leased Audi he stretched for, and book ski trips to Tahoe he couldn't actually afford. And every single time the distance opened up between what they earned and what they spent, and it always opened up, I was the one who stepped into the gap. I want to be honest with you, because I've spent a long year sitting with my own part in this. I built this, brick by brick. I was a lonely widower with a pension and a paid-off house, and exactly one person left on earth I wanted to spend money on. So I did. When they bought their place out in Folsom, I handed them $41,000 for the down payment. Not a loan. A gift. That's what fathers do, I told myself. When my granddaughter came along, her name is Mabel, and she is the whole reason my heart still works. I covered 2 full years of a private preschool, because June said the neighborhood program wasn't stimulating enough. That was $1,600 a month. I paid it and never said a word. My son-in-law never thanked me. Not once. Not one time. When their air conditioning died in the middle of a Sacramento July, I wrote the check. When he wanted to take some executive networking intensive that turned out to be a weekend at a resort in Palm Springs, I covered half. Because June called and said they were tight that month. Tight. They'd just redone the kitchen. Quartz counters, soft close cabinets, a faucet that cost more than my first car. I gave them $14,000 toward it because June promised it would build equity. It built their equity. I never saw a cent come back. I never asked for one. I'm not telling you this so you'll pity me. I'm telling you so you understand the shape of the thing before it bared its teeth. Now, the afternoon I need you to see clearly was a Thursday in late October, my birthday. June had called the week before to say they wanted to take me out somewhere nice. His idea, she said, which surprised me, because the man never once suggested anything that opened his own wallet. She named a steakhouse in Midtown, the kind with linen napkins and a sommelier and prices that make you sit up straight. I said it sounded lovely. I got a haircut. I put on the good shirt Eleanor bought me the last Christmas she was alive. I was looking forward to it like a kid. I drove myself, because I've driven myself my entire life. And I'll stop the day a doctor takes the keys and not one day sooner. They were already at the table when I got there. Mabel wasn't with them. With a sitter, June explained, because it was a grown-up dinner. I should have heard the alarm in that. Mabel adores me. She would have wanted to be there. But I sat down, ordered a club soda, opened the menu, and thought, my daughter planned something nice for her old man. Look at that. The appetizers came. We talked about nothing. The weather. A deal he was chasing. June mentioned Mabel had started reading chapter books on her own, and my chest swelled, and I said I'd love to take her to the library some Saturday. June said, we'll see. She'd started saying that a lot lately, every time I asked for time with my own granddaughter. We'll see. I filed it away and said nothing. Then the entrees arrived, and the temperature of the table changed. He set his fork down. Slow, deliberate. I'd seen that move before. It's what he does right before he says something he's rehearsed in the mirror. June reached into her bag and pulled out a sheet of paper folded in thirds. She slid it across the white tablecloth toward me, past the bread plate, past my water glass, and stopped it right at the edge of my hands. I didn't pick it up. She said it was something they'd worked through with a financial advisor. A proposal, she called it. They wanted me to sell my house, the house I've owned since 1989. The house Eleanor and I tiled the bathroom in over one miserable, laughing weekend. The house June took her first steps in, and used the money to buy something smaller, safer, more appropriate for my stage of life. The leftover equity would go into a shared family account they would help me manage. I said, I'm 68, not 108. My son-in-law nodded, like he'd anticipated that, and said that men my age living alone were statistically at elevated risk for falls, for isolation, and I want you to hear this exactly as he said it early, cognitive decline. He said those two words to my face. Across a $58 ribeye I already knew I'd be the one paying for. I said, where is this coming from? And here's the moment I've replayed maybe 500 times since. June looked at me. Not angry, not sorry, tired, like I was a chore on a list she was finally getting through. And she said it. Dad, you're becoming a burden. She didn't mean to land it that flat. I'm sure of that. I think burden was a word they'd worn smooth between the two of them in private, said so many times it had stopped cutting, and it just fell out of her mouth the way an overused word does. But that's the word she used. Burden. Let me sit in that with you for a second, because I think a lot of you already know this exact feeling. If you have ever given everything you had to someone, your time, your money, your whole quiet heart, and then watched their face go flat as they decided you were a problem to be solved, then you know there's no physical pain that compares. It's a specific kind of cold. It starts in your stomach and climbs. 33 years of mortgage payments on a house I gave her the down payment for. $1,600 a month so my grandbaby could finger paint somewhere stimulating. And the math of all of it added up in her tired eyes to one word. Burden. I didn't shout. I want you to know that. Something in me went very still and very clear instead, the way it used to when I'd be walking a job site and spot a stress fracture nobody else had caught. I picked up the paper. I read it. It laid out a plan where I'd liquidate the single biggest asset I own and hand oversight of the proceeds to my daughter and her husband, wrapped in soft language about consolidating family resources and strategic stewardship. Any law student in his first month would have recognized it for what it was. A polite blueprint for the kind of arrangement where the old man ends up with a checking account he doesn't control and a guest room in a house with someone else's name on the deed. I set it back down. I took a sip of club soda, and I asked her, gently, do you have any idea what that house is worth right now? She said the market was soft. I said the market was not soft. I told her I'd had it appraised 8 months earlier, because I'd thought about a small refinance, and it had come in at $426,000. I told her I'd paid $89,000 for it in 1989. I told her I'd replaced the roof, the windows, the furnace, and the water heater in the last 12 years, every dollar out of my own pocket. I told her there was no mortgage, hadn't been since 2010, that the house was mine, free and clear, and I intended to keep it exactly that way. My son-in-law opened his mouth to say something about how they were only trying to help me plan. I said, let me stop you there. I paid the bill. $360 with the tip, on my card, the one in my name, the one I've never once carried a balance on, because I'm an inspector and I understand precisely how compound interest eats a man alive. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen in the dark for the better part of an hour. Walter would have been a warm weight against my leg if he were still around. He wasn't, so I just sat. Now here's what I already knew by the time I climbed the stairs that night, and this is where the floor dropped out. June had a credit card on her account that was linked to mine. I'd added her as an authorized user 9 years back, when she was finishing her degree and needed something for emergencies only. I never took her off it, because in 9 years it had never once been a problem. I'm a careful man. I check my accounts every Sunday morning with my coffee, and the Sunday before that birthday dinner, I'd seen a charge I didn't recognize. A travel company. $21,200. I'd assumed it was an error, a fraud flag I'd sort out later. After sitting in that dark kitchen, I stopped assuming it was an error. I called the travel company the next morning the second they opened. I told them I was the primary card holder. I asked about the booking. The woman on the phone was kind and thorough, and she told me everything. The reservation was for 3 travelers. Premium cabin, 12 nights. Departing the 19th of November. Destination the Amalfi Coast. Private drivers. A boat day off Positano. A cooking class somewhere up in the hills. All of it prepaid. 3 passengers. June, my son-in-law. And a third name I knew, his brother. A man I'd met exactly twice, who once borrowed my pressure washer and brought it back with the trigger snapped off. 3 people. Premium cabin. 12 nights on the Amalfi Coast. $21,000. On my credit card. Booked 5 days before my daughter looked me in the eye and called me a burden. Read that sequence again, because it's the whole story. They booked the trip first. Then they sat across a white tablecloth and asked me to sign away control of my house. I sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then I went to work. I want to pause here and say something, narrator to listener, because if you're anything like me, your blood is up right now. I felt it too. I felt the heat climb my neck. And honestly, if that were you, if that were me in a worse mood, I think there's a version of this where a man drives to that house and says things he can't take back. I understand that man completely, but I've spent my whole life learning that you don't fix a failing structure by swinging a hammer at it in anger. You fix it with cold, careful, documented correction. So that's what I did, and I think that's the harder thing. I think that's the thing worth showing my granddaughter someday. I called the credit card company. I reported the charge as unauthorized. I explained that while June was an authorized user, I had not approved this particular purchase, and at this dollar figure, I was formally disputing it. The representative was patient and exact. By the time we hung up, the charge was flagged and the card was frozen pending review. Then I called the travel company back. I told them the booking had been made without the primary cardholder's authorization, and I asked about cancellation. Because departure was more than 60 days out, and it had been booked as a package, a full cancellation was possible, with a written request from the cardholder. I sent that email before lunch. Then I did the thing I should have done 9 years earlier. I called the card company one more time and had June removed as an authorized user. And then I drove to my lawyer's office. His name is Desmond. Quiet, careful man, handled Eleanor's estate and never once made me feel rushed. I laid it all out, and showed him the folded paper from the steakhouse table. He read it slowly, took off his glasses, looked at me, and said one word: predatory. He said it like he wanted it to land. He told me that if I'd signed that page, I'd have effectively created a voluntary arrangement with no legal protection for myself, that it wasn't necessarily illegal, depending on the structure, but that every line of it was built to benefit them and not me. He said, and this part stuck with me, that men in exactly my position, older, alone, one adult child, sign things like this all the time and don't realize what they gave up until the day they need it back and it's gone. I told him I had no plans to sign anything. Good, he said. Then he gently suggested I update my estate documents, which I hadn't touched since Eleanor died. I told him I'd make the appointment. I meant it. I drove home. I made a sandwich. I sat on the back porch where the grill stood, exactly where it stood, and I thought about Eleanor, the way I do most days, but harder that one. She was the practical one. She'd have looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Well, Marcus, you already know what you have to do." She'd have been right. She usually was. June called that evening. She didn't mention Italy. Of course she didn't. She asked how I was holding up, in that voice people use when they already know exactly what happened, and they're waiting to see how much you know. I said I was fine. I said it was a nice dinner. There was a long pause. Then she said she hoped I'd really think about what they'd proposed. I said I had thought about it. I said I wasn't selling the house. Her voice changed, sharpened. She said she didn't think I fully grasped what they were offering. And I said, June, I inspected load-bearing structures for 33 years. I understand exactly what's holding what up. And this arrangement isn't built to carry my weight. It's built to carry yours. She went quiet. After a moment, she said she'd talk to me later, and the line went dead. He called 2 days after that, and his voice, I'd never heard it do this before. Smooth, diplomatic, the careful tone of a man who's been coached on what to say. He said he hoped we hadn't gotten off on the wrong foot. I said we were fine. He asked if I'd given the proposal any more thought. I said no, and he pivoted, fast, asked if I'd happened to notice anything odd on my credit card, because there seemed to be some kind of billing snag with a trip they'd booked. I said I was aware of it. He said there seemed to be a problem with the card. I said there was no problem with the card. I said I'd canceled the reservation. The silence on the other end was a whole landscape. I told him I'd also removed June from the account. He asked carefully why I'd do something like that, and I told him, because she'd used it to book a $21,000 vacation to the Amalfi Coast 5 days before sitting across from me and calling me a burden, and I didn't consider that a reasonable use of a card I'd extended as a kindness. He started in about how the trip was a family thing, how they'd always planned to loop me in, how there was context I was missing. And I told him the only context I needed was printed on my statement. He said I was being unreasonable. I said maybe so, but I was being unreasonable with my own money, in my own name, so I could live with it just fine. I didn't hear a word from either of them for 13 days. When June finally called again, something underneath her voice had moved. The tiredness was gone. What replaced it sounded almost scared. She asked if she could come by. I said that was fine. She came on a Sunday, alone, and I noticed that, the way you notice load shifting. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where she did her multiplication worksheets at 8, the same table where she cried at 16 over a boy whose name neither of us remembers now, the same table where we ate cold turkey sandwiches at midnight, the Thanksgiving she came home from college because we'd both been too stuffed at dinner to enjoy it. She didn't look at me for a long time. Then she said very quietly, I don't know how it got like this. And I told her the truth. I said, I do. I said it got here slowly. The way everything important breaks. Not in one loud crack, but in 1,000 quiet settlements nobody bothered to measure. I told her I stopped drawing lines a long time ago, and that when you stop drawing lines, people stop being able to see them. That's not entirely their fault. That's physics. She asked about Italy. I told her the booking was canceled, the charge disputed and resolved, her card access gone for good. I said it the way I used to flag a beam that didn't meet spec. Not cruel, just true. And she started to cry. Not the showy kind. The quiet, mortified kind. The kind that embarrasses the person doing it. She said she was sorry. She said burden wasn't what she'd meant. She said what she'd meant was that she was scared that watching me get older alone in this big house terrified her, and that somewhere along the way she and her husband had talked themselves into believing the thing they were proposing was for me. I let her finish all of it. Then I said, I believe you're scared. I do, but fear doesn't explain $21,000 you spent without asking me. She had no answer. There wasn't one. I want to stop the story right here. Because this is the part that matters more than the credit card, more than the lawyer, more than any of it. I could have ended her right there. I had every receipt. I had the moral high ground stacked to the ceiling. And there's a version of me, a younger and angrier version, who would have used it, who would have made her sit in that shame until it scarred. But I looked at her crying at the table where she learned to read, and I understood something I want you to understand too. She wasn't a villain. She was a frightened person who'd let a small, ugly idea grow in the dark, because nobody ever turned the light on it. And I was the one who'd kept the room dark, for years, by giving and never once saying a hard word. If you have ever loved someone who hurt you, and found that your anger and your tenderness were sitting in the exact same place in your chest, refusing to separate, then you already know how that kitchen felt. So here's what I said. I said, this house is mine. My money is mine. I'm 68 years old. I've got a clean bill of health. I drive myself everywhere, and I run my own life. The day I can't do those things, I have a lawyer, a doctor, and enough sense left to ask for help. What I don't need is you and your husband deciding for me before that day ever comes," she asked, in barely a whisper. "So what happens now?" I told her. "That part's up to you." I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't cutting her out. I wasn't holding a grudge I couldn't set down. But I was done being a resource that got drawn from without warning. I was done being managed like a line item. And if she wanted a relationship with me, not with my house, not with my account, that was something I wanted more than she could possibly know. She stayed 2 hours. We didn't talk about money again. We talked about Eleanor. We talked about things she remembered from being small that I'd never known she carried. We talked about Mabel, and how June wanted her to actually know me, not visit me twice a year on holidays, but know me. When she left, she hugged me at the door and held on a few seconds longer than she has in years. I stood on the porch after her taillights disappeared and looked at the old liquidambar tree in the corner of the yard, the one Eleanor wanted to cut down once because it dropped those spiky seed balls all over the lawn. I'd talked her out of it. Told her the tree wasn't the problem. We just had to rake more often. She'd laughed and said I could engineer my way out of anything. Standing there in the dark, I wasn't so sure that was a compliment anymore. Some things you can't engineer around. Some things you just have to feel all the way through. A few weeks later, I sat down with Desmond and rewrote my estate. June is still in it. I love her, that was never the question. But the structure is different now. Cleaner. With the kind of protections that don't leave a crack for a folded piece of paper to slide through on a man's birthday. Desmond said I was making smart choices. I told him I was finally making the choices I should have made a decade ago. This whole thing taught me something I wish somebody had told me at 50. The people who take advantage of you almost never start by taking. They start by receiving, and you start by giving, because giving feels like love. And somewhere in the middle, without any alarm going off, the giving becomes expected, and the receiving becomes owed. By the time you finally notice the ground has shifted, you've been silent so long that speaking up feels impossible, like you'd be the one breaking something, when really you'd just be the first one to name what was already broken. So if you take one thing from an old inspector, take this. Go look at the quiet arrangement in your own life, the card you added just for emergencies, the help that became a habit, the line you stopped drawing because the conversation felt too hard. Look at it this week, not next year, this week. And then ask yourself the question I should have asked myself years before that birthday dinner. Am I giving because it's love? Or am I giving because I'm afraid of what happens if I stop? Sit with that one. It's not comfortable. The honest ones never are. Now I want to hear from you, because I've been talking a long time and this story belongs to all of us a little. Tell me where you land on what I did. If you think I did right, that a man's home and dignity are worth protecting, even from his own child, comment a 1. If you think I was too hard, that family is family and money should never come between blood, comment a 2. And if you think the truth lives somewhere in the messy middle, like I suspect it does, comment a 3. I read these. I really do. And tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I love picturing all of you out there, in your kitchens and your cars, and your late-night living rooms. And if you've ever had a moment like mine, where someone you'd carried for years suddenly looked at you like a burden, tell me about it below. You don't have to carry it alone. There are more of us than you'd think. If this story sat with you the way it sat with me while I was telling it, do me a small kindness and subscribe. I share these slow, true-feeling stories about ordinary people holding on to their dignity when it would have been easier to fold, and I'd be glad to have you here for the next one. Mabel comes over this Saturday. The grill's already clean. I've got the cocoa ready before she's even out of her coat. Because that a 5-year-old who still thinks her grandfather hung the moon is exactly what I want to spend what I have on. Not the people who see a balance sheet when they look at me. Her. That's enough. It was always enough. I just had to remember. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Sacramento to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.